Speaker, and just let me start by saying that I personally believe that any group, whether based on sex, race, or religion, is discriminated or persecuted, or any hatred incited, should always be not tolerated for something like that. But what we're here to talk about today specifically is Bill C-279, which proposes to make 3 changes to the law. The first would be to add gender identity and gender expression to the list of prohibited grounds of discrimination in the Canadian Human Rights Act. Second, it would add gender identity and gender expression to the definition of identifiable groups in Section 318 of the Criminal Code. It would be an offence to advocate or promote genocide, to publicly incite hatred likely to lead to a breach of peace, or to willfully promote hatred against groups that are identifiable on the basis of gender identity and gender expression. Third, it would add gender identity and gender expression to Section 718.2 of the Criminal Code, which would direct a judge to consider increasing the sentence beyond its usual range for an offence that was motivated by bias, prejudice, or hate based on gender identity or gender expression. Mr. Speaker, these 3 changes are unnecessary. I will begin with the proposed amendments to the Canadian Human Rights Act. The Act already prohibits discrimination on the grounds of sex. This means that the Act prohibits hiring decisions based on prejudice against women or men. It prohibits sexual harassment in the workplace. It requires reasonable accommodation for pregnancy. The Act protects against these and other kinds of sex discrimination in the federal workplace and elsewhere in the federal jurisdiction. The Canadian Human Rights Act does not require total blindness to the distinction between men and women. Instead, the task of this law is to intervene in situations where people experience certain kinds of discrimination on the grounds of sex. Canadian society recognizes that there are gender norms. When attitudes and practices involving gender become sex discrimination, the law should and does intervene. But the law cannot simply abolish gender categories and gender norms in Canadian society. Nor can tribunals and courts be asked to reconstruct and interpret gender norms. That is an unrealistic view of what the legal system is empowered and entrusted to do. We heard in the course of debate on the previous version of this bill, Bill C-389, and I quote, "Transsexuals are people whose gender identity differs from their biological or birth sex and who seek to live permanently as a gender other than their biological sex. Most often, transsexuals seek medical intervention, such as hormones and surgery, to make their bodies congruent with their sense of their genders. A transition process, which is known as sex reassignment or gender reassignment, is engaged," end quote. In the case of transsexualism, the law has found that gender categories and gender norms cause an unfair disadvantages to those people. Transsexuals might not fit social norms due to their unique situation. But as interpreted in numerous decisions, the Canadian Human Rights Act already protects against discrimination on the basis of transsexualism. This is one situation where the law has intervened in order to remedy a form of sexual discrimination. I understand that there is an intention to cast more light on the disadvantages faced by transsexuals. But what Bill C-279 proposes to do goes far beyond that. This bill does not name a particular group of people in order to protect them from a distinctive kind of discrimination. Instead, it proposes 2 characteristics, gender identity and gender expression, that everyone has. Everyone has gender identity, and everyone expresses their gender intentionally or unintentionally in some way or another. I would like to repeat, some gender norms may be problematic. Some have been found to be discriminatory and have been prohibited. The Canadian Human Rights Act already protects against sexual discrimination. Under this rubric, it also protects against discrimination on the basis of transsexualism. So, it is not clear what problem the proposed amendment is hoping to solve. Again, I would say it's unnecessary and an unpredictable response to a very particular problem. This brings us to the next problem arising from the bill. To the extent they seek to reach beyond transsexualism, the grounds of gender identity and gender expression are vague. How will anyone know whether one's expressive act is gender expression if there can be no assumptions about how each gender is expressed? Can people act in a way they choose, so long as they claim to be expressing their conception of gender? And if that is the case, then the grounds of gender expression will have no limits and will have very broad implications. Or will it be up to the courts and the tribunals to decide what kinds of characteristics express gender, or which do not? I would also create much uncertainty about the meaning of these new grounds and perhaps increased litigation. Mr. Speaker, the proposed wording is vague, and it makes the proposed amendments to the Canadian Human Rights Act unwise, especially since they are unnecessary to address what seems to be to the core issue, which is discrimination on the basis of transsexualism. Vagueness has even more serious implications when we turn to the proposed amendments of the Criminal Code. The amendments to the hate propaganda offences protect new identifiable groups, namely those identifiable on the basis of gender identity and gender expression. The hate propaganda offences are serious. Convictions can result in sentences of between 2 and 5 years. The offences also limit freedom of expression, a core Canadian value, and must clearly delineate so that Canadians will know where the limit is drawn. Given the stakes involved, it is important to know which groups are identifiable on the basis of gender identity and gender expression. Transsexualism might define an identifiable group, but again, the proposed new grounds go far beyond transsexualism. Gender expression is especially problematic. How does a speaker know when a characteristic is one of gender expression? If a speaker says strong words against people with certain behaviours, can that be made into hate propaganda? Or on the basis of gender expression, simply if those people claim their behaviour to be the way of expressing their gender identity? We are left in the dark about who the identifiable groups will be. It is especially problematic if these offences, which would criminalise speech without clear notice of what can and cannot be said. Ultimately, it would be left to the courts to decide which aspects of people's behaviours are expressions of gender and which are not. This is not their role. It also leaves the public unaware of what is prohibited as we wait for the courts to reconstruct Canadian gender norms for us. These same uncertainties attach to the proposed amendment to Section 718.2. This section directs that a sentence be increased for an offence that was motivated by bias, prejudice, or hate based on certain personal characteristics. The list of such characteristics is open-ended. It includes any other similar factor. I understand that one proposed purpose of this bill is to make explicit what may already be covered by that open-ended phrase. However, by adding gender identity and gender expression, what is made explicit are very vague terms. This would be counterproductive amendment. I believe these technical arguments in themselves give just cause to vote against Bill C-279. But I would also like to discuss a very real concern that was expressed during debate on an earlier version of this bill from the previous Parliament. In fact, this argument resulted in the previous bill being dubbed the bathroom bill in certain quarters. The fact is that creating a right to gender identity and gender expression will likely result in men who are in gender reassignment therapy having access to girls' bathrooms. This bill would also give special rights to those who simply consider themselves to be transgendered. The door is open to sexual predators having legal defense to charge of being caught in a women's washroom or locker room. I find this potentially legitimized access for men in girls' bathrooms to be very disconcerting. As sexual predators are statistically almost always men, imagine the trauma that a young girl would face going into a washroom or a change room at a public pool and finding a man there. It is unconscionable for any legislator, purposefully or just neglectfully, to place her in such a compromising position. This bill does not address the very real possibility, and in itself is a reason for me to personally not support it. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, I say that this bill is unfocused and unpredictable response to the very particular challenges that are faced by transsexual persons. The amendments to the Canadian Human Rights Act and the Criminal Code are unnecessary, and I will not be supporting the bill. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.